Welcome, Gloria.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Trying to make this play, but my my floating bar is in my way.
You can move it, you can drag it.
Can you? There we go. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
All right, now let's click play. All right. So what I will be talking about today is reporting MEP services, how states keep track of data and services. I'll speak a little bit about how we do it here in Ohio, and I'll mainly go into more of what needs reported, when, CSPR, all that kind of data. Okay, there we go. So of course, like I said, we'll talk about Ohio State database, what data needs collected, the minimum data elements, and the timelines in which those data elements need to be up into M6, the regulations and M6 reports, priority for services. I'll talk about how we do it here in Ohio, the category 1 and 2 counts and how that pertains to the CSPR data that's required, and then a little bit about the residency verification process. So in Ohio, we have our own state database. It's Ohio's unique database system. We do host it in FileMaker Pro. And it holds, of course, all the demographic, enrollment, course history, assessment data, all our data from the certificate of eligibility. There's some data in there that we collect that other states do not collect. And then all the records are inputted and then reported to the Ohio Department of Education, which then reports it to the U.S. Department of Education. All the academic data that's in our database is uploaded into the National Migrant Student Information Exchange database. And of course, OMEC is a depository for Ohio's migrant data. Now, this is what one of our COEs would look like. It's just a sample COE. One part of this that we ask for that not all other states do is employer, current family residence. The employer information is not something that's required, but we go ahead and we collect that information just to make sure that all the eligibility is what it needs to be. Home-based information, child student data. I know on other COEs, they collect same information, but it's just situated different on the COE. And then of course, the eligibility data, which is the same for all the states. And then we get the parent signature or guardian, and then the signature of the interviewer and the signature of the SEA reviewer. And on the COE, if you see the little bubble up there, it also shows when the end of eligibility date is. That's, for us, it's easy to have it there so that other people can see when their eligibility ends for a child. And with each COE, the interviewer generates and reviews the initial COE. And this might be different from state to state with the interviewee, and they verify that the information is correct. The COE is then submitted to the state approved reviewer. In Ohio, we have 3 steps of quality control. So it goes to our data specialist, she reviews it, and then it goes to Melena, and she's our IDNR coordinator. She reviews, approves it, and then it comes to me, and then I go ahead and input it into our state database. After that, it is then uploaded into M6. And if the COE is correctly completed, then it goes through everything in the signatures and it's approved. But if there's a COE that has anything that needs to be clarified or edited, then we go ahead and do that. We go through the steps to make sure that it needs to be updated, and then we have to have a follow-up process established by our state to either reject or add comments to our COE. And identification and recruitment, of course, any SEA has to identify all migratory children on a statewide basis. And I think we all do that. And we have to include, of course, preschool migratory children and those who have dropped out of school or are OSY. And then we have to report the number of eligible migratory children residing in the state on an annual basis. All the SEAs, of course, must use the National Certificate of Eligibility to document its eligibility determinations, and that's just the one section. The other data that's collected, states can change or ask for different information if they feel that that's what they want in their state. And then, of course, the SEA, in our case in Ohio, that's our office, Ohio Migrant Education Center. We have to establish and implement a system of quality control for the proper identification and recruitment of all our eligible migratory children. And then once again, here's what our COE looks like. And this one, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, has all three signatures, the parent, the recruiter, and then our state SEA reviewer. There's our eligibility data, which all states this part has to look the same. And then for information that you may be looking for that you're going to be reporting, right in there, we have our graduation school, the end of eligibility, so that if the student comes, you know when their eligibility ends, and then the demographic data. Of course, M6 requires also the parents' information and then the students' information. And this, of course, is just a sample COE. None of this data is actual data. We sometimes just use our family's names or whatever. Like I use my family's name, and I think in this one, Milena used herself. So just so that we don't have actual student data on here. And then when you go to report on the CSPR, when you do your migratory child count, you have to say the very first question that you're going to be asked is, do you have, as a state, any concerns about the accuracy of the reported child counts or the underlying eligibility determinations on which those counts are based, and how and when these concerns will be resolved? We usually don't have any of that. We're pretty close to having 100% most of the time, but we don't have any concerns about how accurate our data is. But if we did, we would put it in this little comment box. And then for the Consolidated State Performance Report, we have to capture the Category 1 count, which is any decreases or increases from the previous year. So whatever our Category 1 count is this year or this performance period compared to last performance period. And if it's greater than 10%, you have to have a response for that. For example, because of COVID, we were unable to, have the same amount of students because our say, for example, our numbers dropped 50% due to COVID, unable to meet face-to-face. We were not able to identify, so many students. And so we would say what the percentage was of the decrease or increase, and then an explanation as to why. Oh my gosh, they left me in the dirt. This room was motion censored. So since I was just talking and not moving, the lights turned off on me. Category 2 part of this is the child count increases or decreases on those students that were served during the summer. Okay. And this is the same thing. It has to be no greater or less than 10%. If it is, then you have to have a response as to why it is that it's greater than 10%. And for the critical child count logic elements that the state must address in its description is, of course, children who are ages 3 through 21, the qualifying arrival dates, the residency, as well as 2 turning 3-year-old children, the elimination, or you have to make sure that you're not counting any of last year's graduates or any of your HSED obtainers. So if any student graduated or received a GED, then they're not included in the count. Any of your SEA approved certificate of eligibilities are included. These have to be unduplicated counts, and that's what is under Category 2 criteria. So you take Category 1 and then you go ahead and identify any of the students that were actually in your Category 1 count and just have those students who are actually served in your summer program. So of course, the unduplicated count, like I said before, of category 1, only children who were within 36 months of a QAD, and then that child has to have resided in the state during that performance period. Now here was for the previous year. For this year, it would be 2021, September 1st, 2021 to this August 31st, 2022. And they have to be verified by one or more of the following dates, either an enrollment date, a residency date, a recertification or residency verification date, and then a withdrawal date between 9/1/2021 and 8/31/2022. And so children who are graduated or attained a high school equivalency diploma during the performance period ensures that these children are not counted in the next performance period. And then children who had an SEA approved COE and were entered into the state's migratory student database is included in that. And helpful resources for when you go to do the submission is most of the states get a data check sheet from OME with instructions. If you input all your data from the previous CSPR and then this year's CSPR, that's where you're going to see what the difference was, and if it was either 10%, 15%, 20%, or more, and that is where you go ahead and then put in your comments of why there was a difference, either greater than or less than. CSPR category 1 and 2 counts are 10%. Anything else in the data that's required has to be over or below 25%. So if there's any difference, decrease, increase of 25% or more, then you have to put in a comment for those. The only ones that are 10% is category 1 and category 2 counts. And then there's the rating instrument, and there's the CSPR EdFacts glossary. We submit our information into the Ohio Department of Education. Their EdFacts person then reports it into EdFacts. And usually when they do that, that also throws back anything. If it looks like we're off and they have questions, they'll let us know. We'll check the data and then we'll resubmit to them. And then it goes up to the U.S. Department of Education and Office of Migrant Education. Now there's also the results website with a lot of information in here. And then of course the MEP non-regulatory guidance, and that's in chapter 9. So a lot of these slides are actually from OME on sessions they've done before. And I just wanted to make sure that I was presenting correctly and accurately in what they had said to make sure that I'm not off by any of these things. Okay, so category 1, you have to verify the residency by either school attendance records for those children who were enrolled in a school, written documentation such as an updated COE, if you had any home visits, the category 1 count between September 1st and before August 31st, and a category 1 count who is not enrolled in school. They don't have to be served for that category 1 count. And then any 2-year-old children that were turning 3 years of age, but the staff has to verify the child was a resident in the state after the child turned 3. So sometimes that's a little hard to do, and often we get the recruiters to help us with that, because we can run a report and show all our P2 kids that were turning 3 or had turned 3, but if they were not enrolled in a preschool program, then we have to have the recruiters go out and check to see if that child was here or not. And then of course it has to be an unduplicated child count. For example, each student of course is going to have a unique student ID. We have our own state database that just goes ahead and creates a unique ID for every child. And then when you do your initial student search in the state specific database, you'll also want to do the national system M6 and do a duplicate report by state. And it'll tell you if you have any duplicates in your data. And when you use that, you can go ahead and merge your students so that there's no more duplicates in there, and you're making sure that it's an unduplicated count. So in order to do that in M6, you would go to your reports. If you have your own state database that can run that within your state, you'll want to do that as well. That way, when you put your data up into M6, it gets corrected. And when you have duplicates in M6 that have two different M6 numbers, you'll have to do a separate request for them to merge those students, because that one student that ends up actually without a number, they have to kind of put them to the side, and they keep them in M6. They can't delete them out, but then they do not come up when we go to search and look for student data, because the one student that stayed is the one that's going to have all that information. Now for category 2 is the student that was serviced that summer. And it is, like I said, a subset of the category 1. Any of the children who identified that received an MEP service during that summer intercession term. They have to have been enrolled in the state migrant database with a summer or intercession enrollment for at least 1 day or more. So if a student comes to your school or your program for 1 day, they can be counted. Now, we want them to come every single day of the program, but sometimes they're not there in your state long enough to be there more than 1 day. So if they've at least enrolled in your program and were serviced for 1 day, you can go ahead and count them. In our state of Ohio, we have our building programs, which of course, if they were enrolled at least 1 day, we count them, but we also have our image program. And in our image program, our teachers go out to the students. And in that program, we do require that the student have at least 10 hours of service before we can count that student. It may take 4 days, 5 days, depending on how many hours a day that they service that student. But it's different than that. We do the 10 hours because we think if a regular school day is around 8 hours, then if they're going out to the students and providing those services, it should be about the same. So we just chose 10 hours as a good amount of time to be able to say the student was counted for 1 full day. And then of course you have to ensure that the children are between the ages of 3 through 21 at the time of enrollment. Because if they're under 3, they cannot be served, or if they're over 21, then they no longer are eligible. Okay, a brief discussion. Are you familiar with the M6 child count reconciliation report for category 1 and 2? How many of you are familiar with that? If we can unmute. Okay. We don't
It looks like they're answering on the chat,
okay.
but
So how
they
many
have
do we
the ability.
4?
They say yes, we have 5, 4, 6. Joshua said I barely am, but I'm a recruiter, not a data specialist. Juanita said yes.
So another question to that is, how often does your state run the M6 reconciliation report?
Weekly, says Brenda from Colorado.
Okay, we do that too. That
Monthly.
report is a great report to run to compare with your own data so that you can see how close you are on your count 1 and 2 with M6 data in your own state data. And when they first created the reconciliation reports, I think they had talked about it at the IDEA meeting, and my director Jose came to me and he said, Gloria, you need to find where that reconciliation button is on M6 so that you can reconciliate our data and make sure that our data is correct in M6. And I said, oh, okay, let me check. And I looked everywhere you could find in M6 to try and find that button, and I couldn't find the button. And so I called the M6 help desk and I talked to Dan. Dan Bolin is wonderful. And of course he told me, Gloria, there's no button for the reconciliation report. you have to go through these reports and reconcile your data. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so great. And he said, do you have an hour of your time that you can spare with me? And I said, yes. So does my IT person, our programmer. And he took that hour to go through it with us to understand how it is that report, we utilize that to compare the data to get to where we were almost 100%. Normally we are, but there's also, I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next couple slides or more into the presentation about when you do that, there's a certain date when M6 is kind of like there's a snapshot. And at that same time, you want to be running your snapshot so that you know that your data with M6 data is correct at that time of the snapshot. Now, the accuracy of the data process. So they also ask about your data files. Do you use EdFax? Well, every department is required to use EdFax, but you have to, of course, say in there, do you deploy a process to ensure that it transmits accurate migrant data to the department using EdFax? And of course, you have to answer yes or no. In the bigger states, I don't know who all is in the session, but if it's a bigger state, if you're a recruiter, you're not going to know this, but for anybody who's an administrator and they do this, then they'll know what I'm talking about. And so this is the way that you have to process and send your files up into your department in your state, and then from them to OME. So that's what's used. And then of course they ask you, are you using M6 to verify the data quality? So are you using M6 to compare your data and make sure that it's quality data? And you have to say yes or no. And of course, hopefully every state is using that to make sure that the quality of the migrant data is what it should be. And then if it is utilized, you have to explain how you're doing it, what it is that you're doing. Like you're running the residency verification reports, you're running the duplicates reports, you're running the reconciliation reports. You write down exactly what it is that you're doing and how it is that you're utilizing M6 in your database counts. And then of course they ask you about your interview process for that performance period. So it'll ask, what was the number of eligibility determination that you sampled? Like for us in our database, our programmer will just have our database pick a certain time all the way to the seconds, and whatever number that landed on, whatever COEs that it goes through, it'll pick whichever one was done ending in that number. Like if it was a 5, it'll take every single COE that had been inputted that ends in a 5 and pull them into our eligibility sample. Okay, because that has to be just random. It can't be someone picking out COEs. It just has to be a random sample. And then those re-interviews have to be completed. So you have to put in how many were sampled, how many of those were re-interview completed, because sometimes you can't find the family. They've already left and you can't do a re-interview. So they want to know, how many did you have sampled? How many were you able to do in a re-interview? And then the number of eligibility determination sampled for which a re-interview was completed and the child was found eligible. Now, sometimes when a re-interview is done, you may find that a student did not qualify, or you may have not been able to find the family at all. So they want to know the difference in that data. And then, of course, they ask, in what was the most recent year that you had your independent prospective re-interview? Like for here in Ohio, what we do when it's not the independent prospective re-interview and we can do it in-house, what we'll do is pick different recruiters and they like re-interview their own each other's COEs. So somebody from over here, say in one region, will re-interview the families over in someone else's region and so forth. So it's not the same person doing the re-interviews. It's a different recruiter from a different area who doesn't know the families, doesn't know anything about them. And so they do their own independent re-interview within our state. Whenever it's a independent prospective re-interview, then we have to get bids, and then we get somebody that's outside of the MEP that comes in, and they do re-interviews for us. And that's an independent person that comes in and does that, for at least for us in Ohio. That's how we do it. Other states may do that a little bit different. And so if you didn't have any of those 3 performance periods, you have to explain in the comment about what year it was or why you didn't do a re-interview, and that goes in the comment below. And then they want to know about your re-interview process. You'll have to mark there, were your re-interviews conducted face-to-face? Were they phone interviews, or did you do a little bit of both? For us, the past years, it's been a little bit of both. For this year, we're definitely going to do face-to-face re-interviews, at least for those families that are willing to do that. If we have any families that are don't want to do face-to-face, still there's that COVID that hasn't gone away completely and probably never will. If we can, we'll do phone interviews with those families. And then was there a protocol that you used for verifying all that information and making the original eligibility determination? Yes or no? Were re-interviews independent from the original interviewer? So you have to make sure that whoever's doing the re-interview is not an original interviewer. So someone cannot re-interview their own COE. And then if you didn't, of course, conduct independent re-interviews, you have to describe how you ensured that the process was independent. And you only enter a response if your state completed an independent re-interview in that section. If you didn't and it was an in-house one, then you don't have to respond to that. And then it continues to, once you have done your re-interviews, you put in all the numbers, they want to know what were the results of any re-interview process that you used. And if there were any children who were found ineligible, you have to describe how it is that you corrected those actions. For example, if we found one that was ineligible because they had subsequent moves and the recruiter did not report that correctly, and so those 2 previous subsequent moves did not qualify and the recruiter had qualified them on a previous move, then that would be one that we would say we found that student ineligible, and you're going to correct that by focusing your training more on subsequent moves, more one-on-one training with that recruiter, whatever it may be that you're doing to correct that that action. Make sure that that doesn't happen again, and what improvements are going to be made by the state to improve the accuracy of its MEP eligibility determination. And then it also asks, does the state collect all the required data elements and data sections on the National Certificate of Eligibility, that one little box where everybody has to have the same information, and hopefully every state is saying yes, because it is the same for everyone. And then the data file submission changes. It used to be due later, but actually now it's due sooner than this. For us, we try and get our data done by October. And then in November, we submit before it's due, so that if there's anything we need to fix or make sure that it's correct, when we do submit it to EdFax, that we have enough time to make sure that it is correct, and then resubmit to EdFax, and it goes to OME. If OME finds any issues with it, then we have to go through a different process, which I'll discuss here, which is the second final submission, which is in March. So the CSPR part 1 is due in December. CSPR part 2 is done in March. After March. March is when you can resubmit if there's any numbers that you had to change. For example, I will use this as an example. We did go through an audit, and I did not know that for IDEA students, which are students who are special ed, that a student who had an IEP is a special ed student. And so We got that corrected. We had to resubmit our data. So we did that by March in order to have our data correct. That was the only thing that we did not have correct when we were submitting the data information. We were submitting 0 because we thought we had 0. Once they went through and saw that we had some, they let us know. And so then now in the future, we will know which students are IDEA students, and we'll be reporting them from now on. And then M6 usually does their snapshot date December 18 of whatever year it might be. So when you're doing your data for this performance period, which would be September 1st of last year, 21, to August 31st of this year, all that data, you have to collect it, make sure it's correct. And then on December 18th, M6 does their snapshot date. You want to make sure that your data is correct at that time, because that is what OME compares to see if your data is accurate and it's the way it should be. And so after that, then I'm sure that when you go to report your information, you have to go through the first submission and then the final submission. And then once again, the due date for the migrant specific data that needs to be, and each file specification is on here. Recruiters are not going to know what this means because this is more of just a data reporting, but I will go over some other things that may help the recruiters. But it's always good to have these due dates because like for example, with us, with our recruiters, we make a cutoff date as to what data we use when we go to report. After certain data, any COEs that have been inputted or have come cannot be included in our counts. Doesn't matter if they moved here before or not. It's kind of hard to show residency if, you know, the student now say September 1st, said they were here since who knows, January, December of this past year. We don't include them in that count because that's sometimes hard to get that date to really show they were resident here in the state. We also use M6 to check that, because if they had an enrollment in another state and maybe they just had their dates wrong, we want to make sure that we check that and correct it so that we don't, if they were and we do need to count them, then we do count them, but normally we don't because we don't know if it was. If we can verify the data, then we go ahead and do it either way. And then of course, the child count resubmission, you can resubmit the category 1 and 2 counts after the first submission. There's also those other counts that you can resubmit as well. But when you do that, you have to send an email request through EdFax to the U.S. Department of Education and OME Program Director for pre-approval to modify your child counts. The request must include an explanation of the data that needed to be changed, why the data needs changed, and what the state is doing to prevent that error in the future. Like for us, it was that IDEA count. And then the request should be sent at least 7 days prior to the EdFax CSPR resubmission window. And then the child count data with either an upward or downward revision without prior approval might not be accepted by OME. If OME accepts that revision from the state, then a formal response via email will be issued to OME's director. Now also that when you have that resubmission, there's a certification signature that's the authorizing official, the chief state of school officer. If any other individual certifies the data submission, the department assumes the following: that the other signatory has been delegated, authorized by that chief state school officer, or that the chief state school officer is aware and has reviewed that data submission. And so for the resubmission review criteria, acceptable resubmission would be for category 1 and 2. The state identifies an error and resubmits the data with OME prior approval. Now, unacceptable resubmission would be when the state resubmits the data after first submission without OME's prior approval. For other file specifications, the state should work to resolve data quality issues that occurred after your first submission. For example, cross comparison of the file spec 54 versus 145. And An unacceptable resubmission would be in order to resolve data quality issues, states take another snapshot after first submission that includes children who were not identified during the performance period. And then they do also ask, you have to report school information, the number of schools that you have that are enrolling migrant students, and then also the number of students enrolled in the regular school year. The number of schools that were MEP funds were consolidated during the regular school year, the state assessment testing that were between the grades of 3 through 8th in math, and also the state assessment testing grades through 3 and 8 for reading, language, arts. And then of course you have to do the English limited performance period. How many were eligible for the special ed? How many had a qualifying arrival date during the performance period, and how many, if any, students that you had that dropped out? And this is just a snapshot of that little part that I was talking about, which has the eligibility data. This is the information on the COE that is actually used for M6 also, to have that last QAD. When you search a student and you look up at that QAD, it's going to be the very last COE that was done, the last qualifying arrival date, and this is where that information is taken from. And of course, in M6, you have to have the minimum data elements. When we first started with M6 back in like 2007, there were only like 25 minimum data elements. Now we're up to about 71. So there's a lot of data elements that we have to collect in order to be accurate. And, you know, for what we need is that data is the minimum data we need to be able to enroll students in the MEP, to put them in the correct grades, to make sure that they're in the right courses, so that they can earn secondary credit accrual. And of course, there's different timelines that we have. Now, newly approved COEs, this is a recruiter responsibility. The time frame to submit all applicable MDEs to M6 is 10 working days from the COE approval date. So as a way to promote the continuity of data between states, Ohio creates an M6 card. We have a little card that has the M6 numbers for that family, and we give that family an M6 card so that they know when they go to the next state, they can take that card and it already has their numbers on it. So when, say, for example, they go back to Texas, then Texas can go ahead and look up their information in M6 as long as that person is an M6 user. But that's one thing that we do to kind of help the families. And we try and promote and let them know that no matter what state they go to, they should try and make sure that they're getting identified and using that card to make sure that they're getting identified in the other states that they go to as well. And then the school or program update. If the information is uploaded to M6, whenever there is a change to a record, it announces too. So whenever there's a change in a record in our database, then we upload that into M6. Now, the time frame for our process to get our data into the database at the end of the term, whether it be summer or fall, is 30 calendar days. But what I have, or what we do, is we have our TR clerks work through WebDirect, which is through the FileMaker database, and they go ahead and put this data in there. So most of our data is in there way before the 30 calendar days. Not all the information is updated until the end of the term, when then we can put in withdrawal dates, we can put in total hours served and other information like that. The change of residency, it's the responsibility of the OMEC office to submit all updated and newly available MDEs within 4 working days of getting a change of address from a recruiter. So we have to make sure that we update that in our database and it gets sent up to M6. Now, if we have any data corrections, it's the responsibility of the project director, data and records coordinator, to respond in writing within 10 working days. So if a parent requests us to correct a date of birth, for example, or the sex of a child, like we put down they were a male instead of a female, and they saw that in the report that they had requested and they want that corrected, then we have 10 working days in which we say, yes, we see the error, we need to correct it. We are working in the process of doing that. And then we correct it on our database, and then it gets corrected up in M6. And so by the end of that process, we have to have all of that done within 30 calendar days. Okay. And then of course, when we have the decision to correct the data, we have to make sure that we tell the parent within 10 working days that we are going ahead and fixing that data. And then here's just a little screenshot of M6, all the reports that are available overall. As you see, there's so many different reports that you can run, and in those reports, you can drill down to the actual student if you need to and compare that data with whatever data is in your state database, or if you're in a consortium like MIS 2000 or something. This is how you can run these reports and then compare it to what you have in your database that you're using, or like Ohio in our own state database. And then this is the M6 reports where you want to check your data quality. Okay, your child count reconciliation is here as well, and then your student mobility. What I want you to focus on is the data quality and the child count reconciliation. OME are running these reports and they're checking your data. And if your data is not correct, they will let you know, and you have to fix that data. Like when we went through our audit, not all our data was in there because we had the data in our database. But instead of putting yes or no, we just had a blank. Or before you could submit just a blank, but that's been changed since we had been reporting it. And so we did not make that change, and we were off on several of our MDEs. And so at this point now, for those MDEs that they were looking at, which was the data completeness, is where you look at most of it to see what MDEs, how far you're off. It'll tell you what percentage is. And I think that here's how, when you do the data completeness, it's going to ask you if you want to do it by the performance period, yes or no. And then if you want to drill down level, do you want to look at it nationwide, or do you want to look at it specific to your state? For us, of course, we're going to do specific to our state because we want to look at our data. And then it'll ask you, do you want to do it for last performance period or the current one? Even if it's not over yet, you can still do this performance period where you're at to that point when you're looking at it. Okay. You submit that, and then this is what you get to see. And of course, this is what it was for Ohio. I did this just before I got all my presentation stuff ready. So as you can see, for category 1, we were off. We're not off by a lot, but we're including more students than what M6 is. So then if you click on view details, it'll go into detail as to which students that they're excluding and how many students are included. So we can check that difference and then look at our database to see why it is that they're not including them or they are including them. And then category 2, at that point, we had the perfect data, 304, and there was none that they were excluding. And then right there is where you have your M6 record issues. If we had potential duplicates, it would have there a number of how many duplicates we had. And then if we hadn't resolved all our near matches, it would also show us how many near matches we had. And then of course, for the MDEs, we can review those and check our data completeness, and we can check our data validity. You just click on review, and then it drills down all the way down to your students. So you can compare each student one by one, M6 database and your own database, to make sure that we're matching. And then for Ohio, this is how we do our priority for services, because it does also ask for that information. This is the form that we use. And of course, a student has to have both a school interruption, and we make sure that those days are between the performance period, at least for the state of Ohio. I know some states go by the year, so it just depends on how your state does this. And then of course, we do always look if the QAD is not between those dates, then we'll look to see if there's a previous school interruption. For example, if they enrolled in Texas on December 1st, that shows that it's a school interruption because it was in between the school year. And that information we would put in there, and then we would mark them as other previous school interruption. If they had none, then we would mark no school interruption. And then for us, the criteria 2, which is at risk of failing, is that the child has an individual education plan or a 504 plan. And of course, the IDEA is for either of the two. And I just put that in there as a reminder for the TR clerks and myself that that is part of that count. The child's grade placement is not age appropriate. They received an LES or NES on their ORA IPT assessment. That's what we use in Ohio. Or for those students that were in the regular school year, if they received a non-proficient designation on our OALPS or OALPA, that's Ohio's assessment, then that also is included. If the child failed or is lacking one or more of the following core subjects, and then of course I'll have to provide a transcript to show that the child failed at least one section of one of the state assessments, whether it be in another state or if it's Ohio, and they have to say which state that was that they received a failure in one of those state assessments. The child was retained in the same grade at the end of the most recent school year. So that would be still in that same performance period. And then if they are an OSY student, we consider that being at risk of failing because they are not enrolled in school. So of course, the student has to meet both those criteria to be priority for services. And then we require that the teachers in the building program and the teachers in the image program have a current list of all their PFS students at all times, because those students are the ones who need additional and more help than the other students. Usually if there's a priority for services students, there's a reason why they're at risk of failing. So they're going to need more help on any of these little subjects here that we have that they needed that makes them at risk of failing. And so all the students get service. They all have different services in the classroom and an image, but when it's a PFS student, we do check to make sure that those services are focused at what is making that student at risk of failing. And then for the residency verification process, the residency verification is what starts your performance period count. So that is what starts your 9/1 to 8/31 count for that performance period. Okay, so we have to verify whether it be what we do in Ohio is we verify if the student was enrolled in school during the performance period. They have to be present at least one day. And then if we can't verify them through the school, that's when a recruiter goes out and does a face-to-face verification. Now, if that student, they can't find the student, then they can do a phone call after they've done a physical visit to the address. They can do a phone verification and talk with the family to see if they're still here. Usually by the time it gets to phone verification, the family says that they're no longer here and they've moved back to their home base state. So we cannot count them in that performance period. But it may be that the kids were in they weren't here, the parents were still here, or the parent moved ahead of time and the parent is like, I'm already in Florida, but my kids are still in Ohio with their dad. They'll be coming later on. And so that we can go ahead and say that we're here because they are still here because they're here with dad, and mom is the one who left ahead of time, or vice versa, dad, mom. And so that is how we do it here in Ohio. Then we do, of course, eligibility reports to make sure that they're in there. After that, anybody who has a COE then, of course, is included in that category 1 count. And then your departure out of state with verification of 1-day residency in the state through the withdrawal process. Now, one thing we do run into sometimes is when a state will do like a mass enrollment. If the students were there the previous school year, then they'll just automatically enroll them the next school year. So we'll look in M6 to see if they were automatically enrolled, and we'll contact them and talk to them and say, hey, are the students really there? Or if we know we've already verified and the school says, yeah, they're enrolled here in Ohio, we will call that home-based state and say, hey, the student's still here. So you need to take off that enrollment line off of M6 because they're still here in Ohio. And we've had to do that sometimes, not a lot, but every once in a while. And then in our IDRC TST groups, they have been doing so much work. And in order to help other states, those with brand new staff, on how to do the residency verification process, we kind of took what different states were doing and put it together into one document. And went step by step on how to do this. And so there are some samples of some of the states, like New York student data verification letter. It just depends on what people use. And we kind of incorporated it and put it all together. And then we also added that guidance provided by OME in regards to that residency verification process. And then, like I had talked about before, you want to make sure that you're comparing your data, the data with your state system. So anything that you see in M6 should match what you have in your state database, making sure that they're between the valid age ranges of 3 through 21. And then, of course, just remember, because this was something where we had to correct our electronic COE, because at first it had populated the date of end of eligibility to be the same date as when they were identified. But actually the eligibility expiration date, which is based on 3 years, is -1 day. So you have to make sure that you're looking at that -1 day from the qualifying date or the 22nd birthday. Okay, so each time a child is entered in the MEP state database system, they should check to make sure the child's age or grade status is eligible to be counted. If not, the system should refuse further data entry by relaying that the information is out of range of acceptability. This should also happen with eligibility expiration dates, residency dates, qualifying arrival dates. For example, in our SIS2 database, we have those that have expired in a different color. Those come up red. So when we look up a student, the student comes out red, and they do not get that little flag, because in our system, when we run those reports, they'll get flagged for category 1, they'll get flagged for category 2. But if that student has expired, then they won't get those flags. And that's how we make sure that they're not counted in our category 1 or 2. And just continued, you want to check that you have the accurate child count, the first and last names are matching. When you get a new COE, I have had students, I had a family where dad's name was, what it was, and then he had 4 sons. Well, he named all of his sons after him. So all the sons had the exact same name as dad. The only difference was the middle initial. So that one we had to double check over and over again, because I kept wanting to think that they're duplicates. We have to merge them, but it was actually 4 boys who were named the exact same name as their dad. So you just want to make sure that you're close and that you have an exact match on birthdays, parents' names, other data points, to avoid duplication. Run those reports in M6. When I first started using M6, I really didn't use the reports that much until I saw what they could do and how it helped with making sure that our data was accurate. And so then I started doing those reports all the time, and we run those reports almost on a monthly basis, sometimes more than that, especially after our audit. So we make sure that we're doing that, and you want to make sure that you're utilizing those reports, because M6 is OME is going to start using M6 as our counts. So if you're in a big state, I know it's a lot harder to manage that data. We are a small state, a receiving state, so we have less data to compare So, it's not that hard for us. So we need to make sure that we are almost 100%. And then these practices will make sure that of the accuracy of both your data in category 1 and category 2 counts. Now,
Gloria,
go ahead.
sorry, I just wanted to give you a 5-minute warning that, yes.
Really? Oh my gosh, I
Yes.
didn't think mine would take that long.
No
Well, prior to
problem.
compiling your counts, you want to make sure that you have quality control in place. It's useful to use the same report to create the reports that are used for the CSPR data. And the report should look at the following different things that are on there. I'm just going to go a little quicker to make sure that I get through everything, because I do know that I had quite a few slides. The state and local data coordinator responsibilities. They're the ones who should be running the various reports to make sure that all applicable COEs have been processed, make sure that your reports are working properly, help the data specialist troubleshoot any issues, process all applicable data changes, requests, merges in your state, run the report to calculate the child in your state MEP system, and run a report in M6 to make sure that those counts match. If they don't, then you want to go through that reconciliation procedure and make the appropriate corrections. Create a data-free snapshot when M6 is doing it, because then that's when you're going to be able to make sure that your data is consistent with what they have as well. You want to run child count and served reports. Completing that data allows MEP staff to catch any errors in the data or possible reporting glitches to be corrected prior to running reports for the CSPR. And then, of course, do data requests in M6. And okay, I was almost done anyways. But I'll leave time for any questions. I can probably stop sharing here. So, no, here we go. Oops.
You got it?
Well, I don't know how to take that off.
Let me see if I can do it for you.
Because all I see on here is new share. I can pause the share.
You should have a stop
I don't have a stop.
on the little ribbon that you moved.
I just see a new share and no.
Leave it up. We can leave it up like that. And
Okay.
if there's any questions from anybody, we can, I can stop the recording. And then if you're more comfortable off the record, thank you, Gloria. I'll stop the recording and we can stay on.